There was one thing Alejandro Santamaria had never been able to tolerate: losing control. He controlled boardrooms with a single look. He closed nine-figure deals with the same calm other men used to order coffee. He controlled his schedule, his image, his emotions, the 42 employees orbiting his executive floor, and the thermostat in his office, which always sat at exactly 19 degrees, because that was the temperature at which he thought most clearly. What he couldn't control was the nausea. That Tuesday morning, with the Madrid sun slanting through the windows of the 41st floor, Alejandro stood in front of his desk. He never sat when receiving the investigator, as if standing gave him some kind of advantage over whatever he was about to hear. He stared at the brown envelope Rafael Mendoza had just placed on the glass, without a word. Mendoza was good at his job precisely because he didn't talk more than necessary. He came in, left the envelope, waited. If the client wanted to ask something, he asked. If not, Mendoza collected his payment and left. 12 years working for men like Alejandro had taught him that people with real money don't need anything explained to them that they already know. Alejandro opened the envelope. For photographs, printed on photo paper, sharp, professional. Mendoza was meticulous about that. The first showed Clara at the entrance of a neighborhood supermarket, carrying a bag that clearly weighed more than it should. Her hair was pulled back in a hasty bun, the kind of bun you make not to look good, but to save time. She wore a jacket Alejandro recognized instantly, because he'd been there when she bought it. Almost 2 years ago, at a flea market in Malesana. She'd said she loved the color. He'd thought he could buy her 50 better jackets. He hadn't said any of that to her. The second photo showed her from behind, pushing a stroller down a street with uneven cobblestones. The stroller was modest, practical, the kind bought by someone who counts every euro. The third photo showed a small square. An autumn afternoon, yellow leaves on the ground, low light. Clara sat on a bench with the baby on her lap, and that was where the nausea began. The baby was watching his mother with that absolute concentration only a few-month-old infant has. The way they study the world, as if every single thing were an urgent discovery. And he had Alejandro's eyes. It wasn't an impression or wishful thinking. Those were his dark, intense eyes, with that slightly almond shape that the Santamaria family had always called the grandfather's eyes. His son, on a bench in a neighborhood square, wearing last season's clothes, with a mother who counted every euro. Alejandro set the photos down on his desk and walked to the windows. Madrid stretched out below him in every direction, orderly, gleaming, crossed by streets he knew by heart, because in some sense that skyline was his. Or at least, that's how he had always felt. In that moment, he felt none of it. His stomach twisted with a violence that had nothing to do with breakfast. Because there's something deeply absurd and deeply human about being the owner of 4 companies, 3 properties, and a 41-story building, and standing frozen in front of a blurry photo of a baby in a second-hand stroller. Money cures nothing except poverty. And in that moment, Alejandro Santamaria was the poorest man in Madrid. Anything significant this week? He asked without turning around. The rent, Mendoza said, with his usual economy of words. She's a month behind. The landlords sent 2 notices. Alejandro closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Only 2. Has she asked anyone for help? No one. She has a friend, Lucia, who brings her things sometimes. Food, diapers. But Clara doesn't ask. She pays back what she can. Of course she does, Alejandro thought. Of course she doesn't ask. She never asked for anything. That was part of what had driven him crazy from the very first day. He dismissed Mendoza with a gesture and waited until the door closed. Then he sat down on the black leather sofa that had cost more than the monthly salary of 3 of his employees, dropped his elbows onto his knees, and stared at the photographs from that distance. The 4th photo was the worst. In it, the baby was smiling. That toothless smile babies have. More effort than anything else. Eyes squeezed shut, cheeks puffed out, little fists clenched as if smiling were a physical task worth giving everything to. Alejandro had a photo of himself at that exact age. His mother had shown it to him once, in passing, like it didn't matter. You were impossible even as a baby, she'd said, with no particular warmth. In the Santamaria family, affection wasn't declared, it was inherited, like the last name, like the businesses, like the inability to say certain things at the right moment. He called his assistant. Cancel the 11 o'clock. The meeting with Hong Kong. Yes, Alejandro. They've been waiting 3 weeks for this one. Cancel it. A pause. Tell them to wait another week. They know it's worth the wait. He hung up, looked at the photos again. There was one detail in the photo of the square he hadn't mentioned to Mendoza, because there was no point mentioning it, because it was a detail that only meant something to him. Clara on that bench, with the baby in her lap, her face tilted up toward the sun, eyes closed. And even though it was a photo taken from 30 meters away with a telephoto lens, even though the details blurred at that resolution, Alejandro could see it. In that moment, on that bench, in that square, under that autumn sky, Clara Vidal was smiling. Without him, with almost no money, with the landlord sending notices. Smiling. That, my friends, is what a woman looks like when she left out of dignity, not bitterness, when she can still smile into the sun with the rent overdue and a baby on her lap. That kind of strength can't be bought. And Alejandro knew it. He'd known it for 18 months. That's why the nausea. Before we go on, and trust me, you'll want to, if this story has already gotten to you, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. It's the easiest way to support this little corner where we come to feel things, sigh a little, and forget the world for a while. Now then, because this is only the beginning. Almost 2 years before that Tuesday, before the photographs and the nausea and the thermostat fixed at 19 degrees, Alejandro Santamaria had walked into a meeting with an interior architect who showed up late, a damp portfolio under one arm and a coffee in his hand that clearly hadn't come from anywhere inside that building. The meeting wasn't with her. Clara Vidal was the assistant at the architecture studio. She'd come to deliver the blueprints the architect had left behind at the office, and she walked into Alejandro's office carrying a large folder, moving at the brisk pace of someone who already had 3 things on her to-do list, and this was the 4th, with an expression that wasn't servile or shy, just simple efficiency. She set the folder down on the conference table. These are the blueprints for level 3, she said, turning to the architect. You left them on the printer. I told you this morning. The architect mumbled something. Clara was already gathering her things to leave. It was right then, in the exact moment she turned toward the door, that Alejandro said something he had never said in 12 years of business meetings. Could you stay a moment? She stopped, looked at him, not with the submissive surprise of someone unexpectedly addressed by an important man. She looked at him with the quick, undramatic assessment of someone who needs to know whether this is going to cost her time or not. I have another meeting at noon, she said. It's 11:20. A pause. She didn't smile, but she didn't leave either. She stayed. And here's where I need to tell you something important, because people tend to get these stories wrong. Alejandro Santamaria did not fall for Clara Vidal, because she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, although she was, in that quiet, unassuming way that's far more dangerous than glamour. What drew him to her, first, was that she was the first person in years to tell him she had another meeting when he asked her to stay. In Alejandro's 40 years of life, people did not have other meetings when he was speaking. People canceled whatever it was. Clara Vidal had a meeting at noon, and it was real, and she didn't cancel it. For a man who had spent his whole life surrounded by people who said yes to everything, it was almost a physical shock. The meeting ended. Clara left, right on time. The architect talked about materials and budgets for another 40 minutes, and Alejandro nodded at all the right moments while thinking about something else entirely. That afternoon, he called the architecture studio with a perfectly valid professional pretext. He spoke with the architect, and at the end, almost as an afterthought, he asked for the full name of the assistant who had brought the blueprints. Clara Vidal Herrero, 29 years old, a design graduate, 2 years at the studio. Before that, she'd worked for an events company. Before that, she'd put herself through school working weekends at a downtown cafe. Alejandro learned all of this within 48 hours. Not because he was having her watched, he hadn't reached that level of obsession yet. That would come later, but because he was a man who, when something interested him, studied it. It was a business habit that sometimes leaked into his personal life. He called her again the next day with another equally valid professional pretext. She answered with the same efficiency as in a meeting, direct, no flirtation, none of the slight shift in tone most people adopted when they spoke to him, that blend of flattery and caution that had bored him since he was 30. When the call ended, Alejandro sat there staring at his phone. Then he dialed the reservation line of a restaurant downtown and called Clara again. There's something I'd rather discuss in person, he said. Are you free Thursday for a meeting? For dinner? A brief silence. That's not exactly a business meeting. Another, longer silence. Thursday I have the afternoon shift off, she said, and he understood that was a yes, even if it sounded like a scheduling note. On Thursday they had dinner at a place where a single glass of wine cost what Clara earned in 2 hours of work. He knew it. She knew it. Neither of them mentioned it, because they both had too much pride to bring it up, for completely different reasons. Dinner lasted 2.5 hours. Alejandro talked less than usual. She talked more than she expected to. She told him about the neighborhood where she'd grown up, about her mother the seamstress, about how she'd learned to draw in the margins of her school notebooks because there hadn't been money for drawing paper. She told him how she'd gotten a partial scholarship and covered the rest working Saturdays. The smell of coffee permanently stuck to her clothes. She didn't tell it bitterly. She told it like someone sharing her story without needing the other person to validate it or feel sorry for her. Alejandro listened. Something, according to his personal assistant, he almost never did in conversations that weren't about business. When he drove her home, a small fourth-floor walk-up in Lavapiés, he didn't kiss her. She hadn't expected him to. That was one of the things that had thrown him most off balance that night. Clara didn't expect anything from him that she hadn't already decided was possible to receive. They said goodbye at the door of her building. She thanked him for dinner with the same easy warmth she would have shown anyone. He walked back to the car, got in, didn't start the engine right away. He thought about how long it had been since he'd felt that uncomfortable warmth in his chest, more question than certainty. He called her Friday, and Saturday, and the following Monday. He reserved 2 tickets to an exhibition she'd mentioned, in passing, that she was interested in. Documentary photography, nothing glamorous, at a small gallery in the Barrio de las Letras. When she opened the message with the booking details, it took her 10 minutes to reply. All she wrote was, "I mentioned that once." He wrote back, "Yes." She took another minute. "Wednesday at 7, then." And that's how these things start, the ones that end up hurting the most. Not with fireworks. With a documentary photography exhibition on a Wednesday at 7. The romance was the kind that builds its own world at a speed that's frightening to look back on. Within 6 weeks, they had their favorite cafes, their walking routes through Retiro Park, their private jokes, their silences that didn't need filling. Clara was one of those people who didn't need to talk to be present. For Alejandro, that had an almost chemical effect. He lived surrounded by noise, meetings, negotiations, calls, people constantly wanting something from him. And being silent with Clara felt like turning down the volume on the entire world. She challenged him without any strategy behind it, not to manipulate him, not to keep his interest. She simply had her own opinions and stated them with the calm of someone who doesn't need permission to know she's right. One night at his apartment, after she'd cooked dinner, she insisted on cooking because she hated feeling waited on. They got into an argument over something that didn't really matter. Alejandro was used to arguments ending the moment he stopped talking. With Clara, that didn't work. She'd wait for him to finish, give it 10 seconds, and then pick up exactly where she'd left off. No attitude, no shouting, no backing down. He watched her through those 10 seconds and thought she was the most interesting woman he'd met in 40 years of life, surrounded by interesting people. The tension between them grew the way inevitable things grow, slowly, at first, then all at once. In the early weeks, it was just contact, the brush of their hands while walking, the way he'd rest his palm on the small of her back to guide her through a restaurant, a gesture that was half habit and half excuse. One time, while they were looking at something on a computer, he leaned over her shoulder to see the screen, and she turned her head slightly, and suddenly his face was 3 centimeters from hers, and neither of them breathed for a second that lasted far longer than it should have. It was a night in November. They'd gone to see a film downtown, one of those long, quiet films Clara loved, and which Alejandro had learned to watch with a patience he hadn't known he had. Halfway through, without either of them planning it, their hands met on the armrest. Neither pulled away. When they walked outside, the Madrid cold hit them, sharp and unapologetic. Clara had her collar turned up. Alejandro put his arm around her shoulders, as naturally as if he'd always done it, and she didn't pull back. They walked 3 blocks like that. At the door of a bar they both knew, he stopped. She stopped too. They looked at each other. And it was she who spoke first, quietly, almost thinking out loud. "This is going to get complicated, isn't it?" He looked into her eyes, those clear eyes he had already memorized without ever deciding to. Probably. She nodded slowly. Okay. And he took her face in his hands with the same calm he used when making decisions that reshaped companies, and he kissed her. It wasn't a rushed kiss. It was the kind of kiss that takes a long time to start and doesn't know when to end. She held onto his jacket with her fingers. He ran his hand through her hair, and she tilted her face up and closed her eyes. And for a moment, the November cold and the noise of Madrid and the rest of the world simply stopped existing, which, frankly, made no sense at all. Listen, I wouldn't interrupt if it weren't important. That kiss matters. That kiss is the root of everything that comes after. Because it wasn't the kiss of two people starting something light. It was the kiss of two people who already knew, in that instant, that this was going to cost them something. Sometimes you just feel these things. What followed that kiss were the most intense months of Alejandro Santamaria's adult life. Months in which he learned things about himself that no boardroom meeting had ever taught him. He learned he could be patient, that he could listen for a full hour about a design project that was keeping her up at night, without once checking his phone. He learned he could laugh at himself when she gave him that, "Are you serious right now?" look she reserved for his most involuntary moments. He also learned that desire can become a way of knowing someone, if you have the patience to build it slowly. Though with Clara, that patience had its limits, because there was something between their bodies that operated on its own kind of gravity, one that didn't ask permission or wait for the right moment, as if they weren't two people choosing each other, but two things recognizing each other. The nights at his apartment were a territory they explored carefully, as if they both knew that what they were building was fragile in one sense and precious in another. Sometimes she'd arrive with her hair damp from the rain, carrying that mixed scent of rain and something that was simply hers. He'd meet her at the door and take her coat, and look at her for a moment before saying anything. And she'd look back at him too. And in that silence, there was more conversation than in hours of words. Their bodies understood each other on their own, like separate entities that had reached an agreement long before their owners had. He'd brush her neck and she'd close her eyes before she'd even decided to. She'd rest her hand on his chest and he'd stop breathing. That specific way you stop breathing when something matters too much. They fit together in a way that had no rational explanation, in which they had both learned not to try to explain. There were nights that started in the kitchen, trying to cook something, and ended with nothing cooked at all. Nights where time lost any clear direction, where the hours passed without either of them counting them, or wanting to. Nights where he'd say her name very quietly, and she'd close her eyes, and that was all she needed to understand exactly what he meant. Nights that seemed to have no end, and neither of them wanted them to. Nights where the world outside the apartment could simply wait. I'm not going to tell you more about those nights, because you don't need me to. You're already imagining it, and what you're imagining is probably close enough. What matters is what happened during the day. By day, Alejandro Santamaria was the CEO of Grupo Santamaria. And the CEO of Grupo Santamaria had a family with a last name that had spent 3 generations building power in Madrid. A mother who had been born knowing exactly what kind of woman belonged in every corner of that world. And Clara Vidal Herrero, with her 4th-floor walk-up in Lavapiés, her partial scholarship, and her flea market jacket, didn't fit into any of those corners. Not because she wasn't worthy of them, but because the Santamaria world didn't run on worth. It ran on last names. The dinner happened in February. Alejandro proposed it with more awkwardness than usual, which was already a sign. He told her he wanted her to meet his parents, and he said it the way you say something you've been putting off for too long, with the tone of someone who's already made the decision and would rather not open it up for debate. Clara looked at him for a moment. Are you sure? Why wouldn't I be? She didn't answer that. She nodded, said yes, and he took that silence as acceptance. It took him weeks to understand it had actually been a question. The Santamaria family estate was in La Moraleja, white, geometric, with a garden that in February had the bare austerity of expensive gardens in winter. Clara arrived in a simple, elegant black dress, the right shoes, her hair down over her shoulders. She'd made an effort, in a way that didn't show the effort, and that, too, was part of her dignity. Alejandro introduced her. His father extended his hand with the functional indifference of a man who had already made up his mind before meeting her. His mother, Elena Santamaria de Montoya, greeted her with a smile that had the temperature of a boardroom in January. The first 20 minutes were perfectly civilized, which is the most elegant form of cruelty there is. Elena asked about the architecture studio. Clara answered. Elena asked how long she'd been in the field. Clara answered. Elena said, "How interesting," with exactly the tone people use for that phrase when they find nothing interesting at all. At the table, the wine came from a vineyard Clara recognized, because she'd read about it, not because she'd ever tasted it. She didn't say that. The turn came during the second course. Elena set down her fork carefully, like someone who has decided it's finally time. Clara, do you have family in Madrid? My mother and a sister. How nice. And what does your mother do? She's a seamstress. A brief, calculated pause. Ah. Elena took a sip of wine. What a noble calling. Clara didn't blink. It is. She raised 2 daughters on her own. That takes a bit more than calling. Elena smiled. That smile. Of course it does. A longer pause. Alejandro tells us you two haven't known each other long. How long is it? 3 months. 4, Alejandro said. 4. How quickly things move when you're young. Elena looked at Clara with that gaze that doesn't need words to say everything it wants to say. Young things have their charm, don't they? That intensity, it lasts exactly as long as it lasts. And then one matures and understands that there are more, lasting, decisions to be made. Silence at the table. Clara set her glass down on the tablecloth with a calm that only comes when you're working very hard, on the inside, to produce it. I understand perfectly what you're saying, Mrs. Santamaria. Wonderful, Elena said, satisfied. I just want to make sure you understand what I'm saying too. I didn't come here to ask for permission. I came here for dinner. The kind of silence that has weight. If you could have heard that silence, you'd have noticed Alejandro's father stop cutting his meat. You'd have noticed Alejandro hold his breath. And you'd have noticed that Elena Santamaria de Montoya had, for the first time in a long time, met someone who didn't fold. Elena recovered her composure in 3 seconds. Smiled again, that iceberg smile. What spirit? Then she turned to her son. Alejandro, we need to talk about Lisbon before Monday. And she changed the subject, as if Clara had simply ceased to exist. Alejandro let her change the subject. That was what Clara never forgave, not what his mother had said. What he hadn't said. The drive back was silent, a different silence from the one in the long art house films and the downtown cinemas. This silence had a temperature. It had edges. Clara looked out the car window at the lights of Madrid going by. Alejandro drove with both hands on the wheel, something he never did, which she didn't know was a sign that he was tense. Clara, not a word. She didn't look away from the window. Let me explain. Explain what? She turned to him then, and Alejandro saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. It wasn't tears. Clara didn't cry easily. It was that specific kind of wound you get when someone you trust leaves you exposed at the exact moment you needed the opposite. She sat there and told me, to my face, that I'm a youthful mistake. And you changed the subject. It's difficult with her. With me it isn't difficult. Silence. I'm not asking you to fight your family, Alejandro. I'm asking you to be present when you're with me. That's all. They arrived at Clara's building. She got out of the car. At the door she paused for a second, as if she was going to say something else. She didn't. She went up the stairs alone. It took Alejandro 40 minutes to drive away. The weeks that followed had that texture of things that never quite get resolved. There were moments of real warmth between them, moments where everything felt like before. Afternoons in Retiro Park, quiet dinners, nights where the outside world didn't exist. But the dinner had left something behind, like a crack in glass that you can't see unless the light hits it just right. And Alejandro, an expert at holding structures together through pressure and sheer will, decided that if he didn't look at the crack directly, maybe it would disappear. It didn't disappear. Clara found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday in April, alone in the bathroom of her apartment, holding the test, her heart doing something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite joy, a mixture of both that exists only in that exact instant. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for 10 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to work. It took her 5 days to tell Alejandro. 5 days during which she saw him, talked with him, cooked with him, slept beside him, and said nothing, because she needed to know exactly how she felt before knowing how he felt. When she finally told him, she was direct, no preamble, no prepared drama. She told him she was 6 weeks pregnant, that she had already made some decisions of her own about it, and that what she wanted to know was how he felt. Alejandro received that with the stillness of a man who's just been told something that rearranges his entire mental map in one stroke. He said the right things. He said he was there, that they'd handle this together, that she didn't need to worry. Clara looked at him. What exactly does handle this together mean? A pause. It means I support you, that I'm not going to leave you alone with this. I didn't ask if you were going to leave me alone. I asked what it means to you that I'm pregnant. And there, Alejandro Santamaria, a man who could handle shareholder meetings and international crises and €30 million negotiations, found himself without the exact words. Not because he didn't feel anything, but because what he felt was too much, and he didn't have the language for it. 40 years in a family where emotions weren't named, only managed, don't teach you how to say certain things at the moment they matter most. Clara took that silence for the answer it was, not the answer he meant to give, but the answer his silence was giving without his realizing it. The weeks that followed carried a tension neither of them named, because naming it meant opening something neither knew how to close, the crack in the glass, now visible to anyone who looked. It was Alejandro's mother who set everything in motion. Elena Santamaria found out about the pregnancy through channels that were never entirely clear and went to see Clara alone at the apartment in Lavapiés. She showed up unannounced, in her cashmere coat, with her designer bag and that iceberg smile. And Clara opened the door, because she hadn't yet learned that she shouldn't. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Elena didn't raise her voice. Elena never raised her voice. She spoke in that soft, clear tone used by people who have had enough power for long enough that they never need to. She told Clara she understood the situation, that these things happen, that the Santamaria family was prepared to be generous, that there was a reasonable sum that could help Clara get her life back on track, that Alejandro had a future already mapped out, one involving certain alliances, certain names, certain responsibilities that someone in his position couldn't simply ignore, that none of this meant he didn't care for her, in his own way. In his own way. Clara listened to all of it, to the end. Then she stood up, opened the door. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Santamaria. The exit's right there. Elena left. Clara closed the door. She stood in the middle of her small living room, with her plants on the windowsill and her books on the shelves, and that life she'd built with real effort. And she understood something with a clarity that hurt the way only clarity can hurt, that in Alejandro's world, she would always have to ask permission to exist. That the problem wasn't Elena Santamaria. The problem was an entire system, an architecture of class and name and expectation in which she had no place. And that Alejandro, who loved her in his own way, was never going to tear down that system for her, because tearing it down required a kind of courage no one had ever taught him to have. That night she talked to Alejandro, told him about his mother's visit. He went rigid, said that shouldn't have happened, that he'd talked to her, that he was sorry. Clara listened. Do you love me? She asked directly, with no trap behind it. He looked at her, and in that look there was so much it was almost painful to watch. Of course I do. More than that world of mine. Silence. Not the silence of someone who doesn't know the answer. The silence of someone who knows the answer and can't say it yet. And that told her everything. I'm not leaving because I don't love you, she told him later. Calmer. In that way she had of saying important things as if she'd already thought them through twice as long as it took to say them. I'm leaving because I understood that in your world, I'll always have to ask permission to exist. And I can't teach a child that. Alejandro opened his mouth, closed it. She left with a medium-sized suitcase, her books, and the plants from the windowsill. No drama. No scene. The way someone leaves when they've had enough time to make the decision quietly, without needing to make it big. Alejandro tried to find her in the days that followed. He called. She didn't answer. He sent messages. She replied to exactly one, in writing, with that clarity of hers that left no cracks. She didn't want visits, didn't want money, didn't want calls. When the baby was born, he could know that much. Nothing more, for now. He read that message 3 times. Then he saved it without responding, because he knew, with the same certainty he knew his mother was right in terms of family strategy, and that knowing it made him complicit in something with no pretty name, that any pressure now would only confirm the worst thing about him, that he was the kind of man who used power to bend other people's will. He didn't want to be that man, even though he still didn't fully know how not to be. Alejandro let her go, or at least, that's what it looked like. Spoiler, he did not let her go. No man who has ever known someone like Clara Vidal can simply let her go. What he can do is pretend to let her go, while hiring private investigators and canceling meetings with Hong Kong so he can stare at photos of a baby with his own eyes. That's what he could do. And that's exactly what Alejandro did for 18 months. He came up with a plan that took 4 months to put into motion. Alejandro was meticulous, even in his obsessions, never impulsive. He'd thought it through from every angle, scrapped it 3 times, rebuilt it. He knew what Clara would think if she found out. He knew how much anger it would cause. He knew it, and he did it anyway, because it was the only path he could think of that didn't involve showing up at her door with a bouquet of flowers she'd throw back in his face, and rightly so. He bought a mid-sized professional services company that had been on the market for years, looking for a buyer. A real company, with real operations, real employees. He folded it into his group with the same quiet discretion he used for acquisitions of that size every month. No one raised an eyebrow. Then he restructured the company's design and communications department, created a new position, executive assistant to general management, with access to every project in the department, a competitive salary, a stable contract. The kind of position someone with Clara's profile would find very hard to come by on the open market. The job listing was published anonymously, with no mention of Grupo Santa Maria. The hiring process was real. There were interviews. There were other candidates. Clara made it through every round because she was, genuinely, the best candidate. That's what he told himself, so he could sleep. The day she signed the contract, Alejandro was in Amsterdam closing another deal. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. Miss Vidal signs today. Alejandro looked at it, put the phone away, kept going with the meeting. Inside, he felt something that, in another emotional language, might be called relief. In his own, he simply called it a step in the right direction. The following Monday, Clara Vidal arrived for her first day of work. She arrived on time, dressed simply and neatly, a cream-colored blouse, dark trousers, her hair down because it was warm out. She carried that first-day energy, that mix of nerves and determination she always turned into visible efficiency. The receptionist showed her around the building, her desk, the structure of the team. Tomorrow you have your introductory meeting with general management, the receptionist said. Clara nodded. The day went well. She learned the company's systems, met 2 colleagues, took notes on 3 ongoing projects. A clean, professional Monday. Tuesday morning, at 9 sharp, her desk phone rang. General management is expecting you. Clara grabbed her notebook, took the elevator up to the executive floor, walked down the hallway to the door she'd been told to find. Knocked twice. Come in. She opened the door, and there was Alejandro Santa Maria, standing by the windows in the dark suit he wore on Tuesdays, because Mondays were gray and Fridays were navy. Standing the way only a man who has occupied rooms his whole life can stand. With that face she knew by heart, and had been trying to forget for 18 months, with mixed results. Clara stopped at the threshold. He looked at her. Neither spoke for 3 seconds that were significantly longer than any clock would suggest. She spoke first, in a voice that came out calmer than she felt. You did this. Alejandro didn't answer right away. That alone was an answer. Tell me you didn't buy me a job to make yourself feel better. He moved slowly, unhurried, from the windows toward his desk. He looked at her with that calm she had always found so irritating, because she never knew if it was real coldness, or the greatest exercise of self-control she'd ever seen in a human being. I didn't buy you a job, he said. I bought the company that could hire you. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and then, in a voice that didn't rise a single note, but carried the full weight of 18 months, said, You are absolutely unbelievable. And I'm going to stop here for a second, because I need you to appreciate this scene in full. She spent 18 months alone with a baby, the rent overdue, rebuilding her life from nothing. He spent 18 months buying companies, paying investigators, and canceling meetings with Hong Kong. And now here they are, the 2 of them, in this glass room 41 floors up. And she's looking at him like she just discovered a new species that isn't in any zoology textbook. Absolutely unbelievable. That's what she said. And I'm telling you, she's right. You need the job, Alejandro said, with that way he had of stating uncomfortable truths without anesthesia. Don't use that against me. I'm not using it. I'm telling you. What's the difference? The difference is, you can walk out right now if you want. The door isn't locked. The contract has a 1-week notice clause. You signed a real contract, with a real company, for a real salary, for real work. What you do with that is your decision. Clara looked at him, looked at the door, looked at Alejandro again. What do you want out of this? He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with more honesty than she expected. I want you to be okay. I want to know my son. And I want you to give me the chance to do things the way I should have done them from the start. That's not enough to justify buying a company. Something that, in another man, might have been a smile crossed Alejandro's face briefly. For me, it is. Clara took a breath, tucked the notebook under her arm. I have conditions. Tell me. My work is mine. No special treatment. You don't cover for my mistakes. You don't tell anyone who I am to you. Agreed. And you don't come near my son until I decide it's time. A pause. The longest one. Agreed. She nodded once, turned toward the door. Clara. She stopped, didn't turn around. What's his name? A pause. Mateo. Silence. Alejandro said nothing else. She walked out of the room. He stood there looking at the closed door for a stretch of time he couldn't have measured. Then he sat down, opened his laptop, tried to focus on the Amsterdam report. Mateo. His son's name was Mateo. The first days at the company were exactly what Clara had decided they'd be, professional. She arrived on time. She left when her work was done, not before, not after. She answered Alejandro's emails with the same efficiency she gave the rest of the team. She treated him with precise, temperature-free courtesy, the kind that belongs to someone who knows exactly where the line is and has no intention of crossing it. Alejandro watched all of this. Watched it with the attention of a man who knows someone well enough to recognize, behind that flawless efficiency, the effort it cost to maintain it. Because Clara was good at many things, but total indifference had never been one of the things she could fake. And he knew her too well not to see it. The tension between them was the kind nobody in the building could name, but everybody could feel. The kind that made people in meetings instinctively choose not to sit between the two of them. There were moments where the distance they both maintained cost more than it looked. One afternoon, going over a vendor report together, Alejandro leaned over her desk to point something out on the page. He ended up just inches from her. Clara caught his cologne, that cologne she hadn't quite managed to forget, despite trying, seriously, to. She didn't look up right away. She stayed focused on the numbers on the page for 1 second longer than necessary. Here, he said, pointing to a figure. Already saw it, she replied, without moving. There was a moment where neither of them did anything. Then he straightened up. She picked up her pen. That night, on the metro home, Clara realized her jaw had been clenched since that afternoon. It wasn't anger. It was something else. And that something else was the problem. Alejandro tried to keep control. The control lasted exactly 10 days. On day 11, a colleague from the communications department, young, the kind who carries his coffee in a designer cup and clearly thinks highly of himself, started finding excuses to show up at Clara's desk. He brought her documents he could have just emailed, asked her things he could have figured out on his own. He laughed at his own jokes a beat before they were funny. Alejandro watched all of it through the glass wall of his office. Watched Clara respond with natural warmth, no flirtation, but the kind of friendliness she gave anyone who treated her decently, without calculation. Watched the colleague ask her to grab coffee. Watched Clara say yes, because there was no reason not to. That afternoon, Alejandro called the colleague into a meeting that was, on paper, completely justified, and ran 40 minutes longer than necessary. Was that a coincidence? Of course not. Alejandro admitted to himself. Of course not. Sometimes the men who run empires handle their jealousy with exactly the same energy they'd use to reorganize a department. That's just how it is. Clara found out 2 days later. She walked into his office with a report, set it on his desk, and when he looked up, she was staring at him with that specific expression he knew well. The thing with Marcos. What about Marcos? Alejandro, that was a work meeting you called right as we were about to grab coffee. Scheduling coincidence. Clara looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then, you lost the right to be jealous the moment you let your mother say what she said to me, in my own home. And she left. Alejandro stood there with the report in his hand, and a sinking feeling that he'd just lost an argument he hadn't realized he was having. The following week, he found out something about Clara's apartment that Mendoza had mentioned in passing in his last report. The kitchen faucet had been dripping for 2 weeks, and the landlord wasn't fixing it. Alejandro quietly called the building management. The faucet was repaired the next day. It took Clara 3 days to connect the dots. When she did, she walked into his office. The faucet. Alejandro didn't look up from his computer. I don't know what faucet you mean. The faucet in my kitchen, that's been dripping for 2 weeks, that the landlord suddenly decided to fix, even though he's been ignoring my messages for 6 months. Sometimes landlords come around. Alejandro, he looked up. I don't need you to buy my life back in installments. I'm not trying to buy anything. No, you're trying to manage me. And there's a difference. That landed, because it was exactly true, and they both knew it. I don't know how to do this any other way, he said, with an honesty that surprised even him. Clara looked at him. For 1 second, something in her expression softened. Just 1 second. Then learn. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Alejandro had spent weeks resisting the urge. He'd driven past Clara's neighborhood 3 times with excuses he didn't even believe himself. But that Wednesday he had no excuse. Just a canceled meeting, 45 minutes free, and an address he knew by heart without ever having looked it up. The daycare where Clara dropped off Mateo was a 6-minute walk from her building. Alejandro knew that because Mendoza had told him, and that, even though he didn't want to admit it yet, was part of the problem. He parked half a block away, walked slowly, stopped at the corner across the street. Parents were waiting at the door. Pickup time. Inside, the noise of children, that particular racket daycares have, somewhere between chaos and pure joy. Clara came out fourth. She wore a brown coat he'd never seen before, new, or at least new to him, and her hair pulled back. She carried the folded stroller under her arm, because it was easier that way, with that efficiency of a woman who's learned to do alone what used to take 2 people. And behind her, holding the hand of a caregiver who was carrying the stroller strap, came Mateo. Alejandro hadn't prepared himself for that, for seeing him in person, in motion, life-sized. Mateo was 11 months old. He walked with that wobbly, sovereign confidence toddlers have when they've just discovered legs are good for more than they thought. He wore a slightly crooked blue wool hat. His cheeks were red from the cold. And when Clara crouched down to pick him up, the boy raised his arms toward her with a happy urgency that made Alejandro feel something in his chest that didn't have a name in any business language he knew. She lifted him up. Mateo put his hand on her face. Clara laughed. And Alejandro, 15 meters away, both feet planted on a Madrid sidewalk, with the world going on around him as if nothing were happening, felt something in him crack in a way that no amount of money, willpower, or any of the tools he'd used his whole life could fix. That child had his eyes and his mother's laugh, and he existed in the world without ever having chosen to, the way every child does, with an innocence so total it was physically unbearable to watch from the outside. Alejandro stayed on that corner until Clara turned down the next street. Then he went back to his car, sat down, didn't start the engine. That was the moment Alejandro Santa Maria understood the true cruelty of his punishment. It wasn't that she didn't love him. It was that his own son could grow up never knowing he existed. And for that one thing, all his money, all his power, every company he could buy, every meeting he could cancel, every thermostat he could control was absolutely, completely useless. He didn't sleep that night. It was a few days later that something happened, something Alejandro hadn't seen coming clearly enough. He had forgotten, or maybe hadn't wanted to think about, that he still had Mendoza's last envelope in the left drawer of his desk. He'd left it there one Friday, meaning to take it home. He forgot. Clara stepped into his office to drop off an urgent document while he was in a meeting on another floor. The drawer was slightly open. It wasn't snooping, it was the kind of thing that happens when someone reaches for a pen in a desk they know well. The envelope had no return address, but it had photos. She saw them for 3 seconds. That was enough. It was her, with Mateo, in the square, in the flea market jacket. When Alejandro returned to his office 20 minutes later, Clara was standing by his desk, not visibly angry, but with something worse. That cold calm she used when she was truly hurt. The envelope sat on his desk. How long? She asked. Alejandro looked at the envelope, then at her. Since Mateo was born. Silence. Photos of me. Of my son. Every week. I needed to know you were both okay. You weren't keeping an eye on us, Alejandro. You were watching us. There's a huge difference between those two things, and I need you to understand that." He said nothing, not because he had no answer, but because the right answer didn't exist. "You asked permission to meet Mateo," she went on. "That was right. But you've spent months knowing things about my life I never gave you permission to know. That's not okay." "I know. Do you know it? Or are you just saying it because I'm standing here?" A long pause. "Both," he admitted. Clara gathered her things from the chair. "End it. If you want to know how Mateo and I are doing, you ask, like anyone else would." She walked out without waiting for a response. That afternoon, Alejandro called Mendoza. In the contract. Mendoza didn't ask anything. He hung up. And although no one saw it, and nothing was recorded, that was the moment Alejandro Santamaria did, for the first time, something with no strategic upside, no calculated benefit. He simply let go of control, because someone had asked him to, and they were right. For a man raised on the logic of power, that was harder than it sounds. Saturday morning, Alejandro arrived at Clara's apartment 10 minutes early, which, for him, was practically aggressive punctuality. Carrying a gift he already knew, before he even walked in, was the wrong gift. It was a handcrafted wooden horse, imported, with hand-carved details. It cost what Clara made in a week. The salesman had told him it was educational and classic, with the face of someone who can spot a guilty father from 3 meters away and price accordingly. Clara opened the door, looked at Alejandro, looked at the horse, looked back at him. "He's 11 months old, Alejandro." The salesman said it was educational. "The salesman saw your guilty face and tripled the price." She let him in. The apartment was small and clean, with that particular warmth of places where someone has made a home out of what they had. No pretense, no resignation. There were plants on the windowsill, the same ones, the ones she'd taken with her. Books on the shelves. Toys neatly arranged in a basket near the sofa. A folded baby blanket on the armchair. Alejandro took it all in. Then he looked at the boy. Mateo was on the floor, in the middle of the living room, with the absolute concentration of someone engaged in a task of the highest importance. The task was trying to fit a round piece into a square hole. It wasn't working. This didn't seem to discourage him in the slightest. Alejandro stood there. He didn't know what to do with his hands. This man, who knew exactly where to put his hands in a boardroom, in a negotiation, in any professional setting imaginable, stood in his son's living room with his hands hanging at his sides like accessories he didn't remember asking for. Mateo looked up, studied this strange man standing in the living room, with the brutal efficiency babies have, no social filters yet, deciding in seconds whether something is interesting or not. Apparently Alejandro passed the test, because Mateo held out his arm and offered him the round piece. Alejandro crouched down, took it, tried to fit it into the square hole. It didn't work. Mateo watched him with a patience that was either compassion or amusement, hard to tell, at 11 months. Clara, in the kitchen making coffee just to have something to do with her hands other than watch them, heard silence for a moment, and then heard the boy laugh. Small, solid, unguarded. She stopped at the doorway. Alejandro was sitting on the floor in a suit that cost what it cost, trying to assemble a plastic shape sorter while Mateo supervised the process with the serious attention of a quality inspector. Alejandro looked at him. He looked at him with an expression Clara had never seen on his face in all the months she'd known him. No control, no calculation. Something so open and so vulnerable that she had to look away, because if she kept watching, she was going to feel something she wasn't ready to feel yet. When Alejandro finally lifted the boy and held him for the first time, he didn't say anything for several seconds. He just breathed. Mateo grabbed his finger with his whole hand, and Alejandro, very quietly, almost without a voice, said, "Sorry it took me so long, champ. And if anyone watching this didn't feel a single thing just now, might want to check for a pulse. I'm just saying, is Alejandro earning it yet, or not quite? Tell me in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the moment." It took Elena Santamaria exactly 16 days to find out Clara was working at the company. She showed up one Thursday at noon, unannounced. That was her style. Clara was in the hallway of the executive floor when she saw her step off the elevator. Instinct told her to turn around. Dignity told her not to. She held her ground. Elena saw her. Showed no surprise. She'd known before arriving. She walked toward her with the calm of someone who's never in a hurry, because she believes time belongs to her. I see you found your way back in through the service entrance. Clara held her gaze. Don't worry, ma'am. This time I came in through human resources. More humiliating, but at least there was coffee. A passing executive pretended not to have heard. Two assistants exchanged a quick glance. Elena was about to respond when Alejandro's office door opened. He'd heard from inside, recognized his mother's voice in the hallway before she'd finished her first sentence. He stepped out, looked at his mother, looked at Clara, and this time, he didn't stay quiet. She didn't come back on her own, he said, with a calm that wasn't coldness, but something heavier. I brought her here, mother. This is not the time. And if anyone has something to say about the mother of my son, they say it to me, to my face, not in a hallway while I'm 10 meters away. Silence on the executive floor. Elena looked at him, then at Clara, then back at her son, with that assessment of a woman who's spent decades being the most powerful person in any room she enters. We'll talk at home. Sure, Alejandro said. Whenever you'd like. Elena left. The elevator doors closed. In the hallway stood Alejandro, Clara, and the silence of everyone who'd listened without looking. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. Are you okay? He asked. Yes. A pause. Thank you, she said quietly, without any flourish, the way someone thanks a person for finally doing what they should have done from the start. Nothing more. Alejandro nodded, went back into his office. Clara stayed a moment longer in the hallway, her heart doing something she chose not to examine too closely. What came next was the family's counteroffensive, arriving on 3 fronts. Alejandro's father called to tell him he was risking his position on the board. The family lawyer suggested, discreetly, that it might be wise to formalize things regarding the boy, a polished way of saying they could request a paternity test and settle custody legally. And a journalist from a business magazine received, from some anonymous source, information that the CEO of Grupo Santa Maria had a child outside of any formal relationship. Alejandro responded to the journalist in person, calmly, without hostility. He confirmed he had a son, confirmed the mother was someone he knew and respected, said the rest was private life, and if that was news, the industry had bigger problems than him. The journalist published nothing that could be used against Clara. Alejandro's mother sent Clara an envelope. Inside was a check and a 2-paragraph letter, handwritten in the perfect script of someone who's had a secretary for decades, but knows certain things carry more weight when written by hand. Clara folded the check, put it back in the envelope, and left it on Alejandro's desk. On top of it, she left a note. Your mother already bought me 1 humiliation. Tell her I'm not selling the boy for a second one. Clara Vidal. Ladies and gentlemen, take notes. The storm hit on a Wednesday night, when only 3 people were left in the building. Security, on the ground floor. Alejandro, in his office. And Clara, who'd stayed behind to finish an urgent report due the next morning at 9. At 8:30, the Madrid sky decided it had had enough of holding back, and opened up without warning. Clara stared out the window. She needed to pick up Mateo from Lucia's at 9. She picked up her phone, called Lucia. Don't worry. He's happy here. I'll send pictures. Come whenever you can. Clara breathed, went back to the report. At 9:15, with the storm still going strong, she finished, gathered her things, put on her coat. Passing through the executive hallway, she noticed light coming from Alejandro's office. She didn't think anything of it. Kept walking. She reached the ground floor. The security guard looked at her with the face of someone who, at 9:15 at night in a storm, has already seen enough. No taxis available. The metro's delayed, flooding at 2 stations. A pause. I'd wait it out if I were you. Clara looked at the door. The rain hit the glass with the conviction of something that has all night. She went back upstairs, knocked on Alejandro's office door. What are you still doing here? He said when he saw her. Same as you. Working. A pause. No transport. He stood up, went to the side cabinet, pulled out a wool jacket he kept there for early morning trips. Held it out to her. For the cold. I'm fine, Alejandro. She took it anyway, put it on. It smelled like him. That cologne of his, something fresh mixed with something darker, the one she'd spent months trying not to remember in detail. She didn't say anything about that. She sat on the office sofa with her laptop. He went back to his desk. For 40 minutes they worked in silence, the storm outside, the warm light of the office inside, and a distance between them that was physical, but not the only kind there was. It was Alejandro who spoke first. Mateo, is he okay with Lucia? He's fine. Sleeps well. A pause. Now, anyway, the first few months were hard. Alejandro nodded. He was looking at the screen, but not reading it. Were you alone? I had Lucia. That's not what I asked. Clara set the laptop down on the sofa. Looked at him. Yes. I was alone. Silence. I know. A pause. I don't know how to say I'm sorry without it sounding like it's not enough. Then don't say it yet. When you've shown it enough that the words don't have to do all the work. Alejandro got up from his desk. He didn't walk toward her abruptly. He walked slowly, like someone who knows that space matters, and that crossing it wrong could break the little there was left. He stopped a meter from the sofa. Clara looked up at him from where she sat, and there it was, that distance between them, a meter that was also everything that had happened, and everything they both knew hadn't happened yet, and all the tension of weeks of offices and hallways and glances measured not to last too long. Don't look at me like that, she said quietly. Like what? You know what? I don't know how to look at you any other way. Clara held that for a second, then stood up. They were closer now than they'd been in a long time. He could see the details of her face you only see up close. She could feel the warmth he gave off, that specific warmth of his, tied to presence, to size, to simply being there, very physically. He raised his hand, stopped it a centimeter from her face. A question. She didn't step back. He brushed her cheek, just that, with his knuckles, the smallest way possible to touch someone. Clara closed her eyes for a second, opened them, took a step back. Don't confuse nostalgia with love. He looked at her. I confused pride with strength, that's true. But I never confused what I felt for you. Clara picked up her laptop from the sofa. His jacket was still on. The storm's letting up, he said. A little. I'll call a taxi. I'll take you. Just to your place. No agenda. No conditions. A long pause. Okay. And that, okay, wasn't surrender. It was a small opening. The kind of okay that costs as much as it costs to reopen, even a millimeter, a door you closed with everything you had. That, my friends, was the first real step, not Alejandro's first. Hers. And Clara Vidal's first steps were always worth double. The annual Grupo Santa Maria Gala was one of those events that, on the Madrid social calendar, function as a kind of scoreboard, who's doing well and who isn't. 5-star hotels, dark suits, polished speeches, alliances sealed somewhere between the cocktail hour and dessert. Alejandro had attended 12 of these galas. He'd never liked a single one. He'd never missed one either. This year, Clara was part of the communications team running the event. She designed the layout of the materials, coordinated the vendors, solved 3 last-minute crises with the same quiet efficiency that had, by now, become her signature at the company. She arrived with the team in a simple black dress, exactly right for her role that night. She hadn't come to shine. She'd come to work. Alejandro watched her arrive from across the room, watched her talk to the catering manager, sort something out with the sound technician, cross the room with that way she had of moving, not asking for space, but simply taking it, because she knew where she was going. And he thought, she's the most capable person I know, and I left her alone for 18 months with that capability, a baby, an overdue rent, and that has a name, and it isn't a pretty one. Elena Santa Maria arrived with Alejandro's father at 9 sharp. She found Clara by the materials table, giving instructions to someone on the team. She approached. You're still in time to correct this mistake, she said quietly, but not privately. Clara turned slowly, looked at her. The mistake of doing my job well, Mrs. Santa Maria? Or, sorry, which one do you mean? Don't be impertinent. I'm not. I'm direct. There's a difference. Elena was about to continue when Alejandro arrived. He'd crossed the entire room the moment he saw what was happening. He didn't run. He walked, but with a speed that didn't belong to a gala. Mother. Elena turned. Alejandro, I know exactly what you were doing. Silence. The circle of people who'd been listening without looking waited, without knowing what they were waiting for. Alejandro looked at his mother, then at Clara, then at the entire room, and picked up the microphone from the master of ceremonies, 3 meters away. Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the interruption. The room went quiet. Alejandro spoke without preparation, without the speech he'd rehearsed for that night, with the voice of a man who has decided to stop managing what he feels. 18 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I let the woman I loved walk away, believing there was no place for her in my world. A pause. The truth is, my world was too small for her. Total silence in the room. I'm not here tonight to clean up any family name. I'm here to say that the only name that matters to me is the one my son is going to carry with pride, if his mother allows me to stand beside him. He set down the microphone. In the room, you couldn't even hear the ice in the glasses. Elena Santamaria's face carried an expression that wasn't easy to read, because it mixed several things that rarely shared space on her face. Alejandro's father stared at the tablecloth, and Clara, standing by the materials table, a clip still in her hand, hair pulled back, in that black dress with no pretension at all, had eyes that shone, briefly, before she brought them under control immediately, because she was Clara, and control was the last thing she ever let go of. Alejandro crossed the room toward her. The company can survive without me, he said quietly. Just, my son doesn't have to grow up without his father. Clara looked at him. That was a public declaration. At a business gala. Yes. You're absolutely unbelievable. You told me that once already. This time I mean it differently. How is it different? With that voice she had when something truly moved her, lower than usual, with a warmth that had nothing to do with the room. That's how she said it. And Alejandro noticed. Of course he noticed. This man notices everything when it comes to her. The 3 weeks following the gala were unlike anything before. There were no grand gestures, no declarations. There was something harder to see from the outside, and more real when you lived it from within. Alejandro learning how to simply be there, without using power to do it. One Tuesday afternoon, he showed up at the daycare with Clara's permission. He didn't bring anything, just stood beside her while Mateo toddled toward the two of them with that clumsy, joyful urgency 11-month-olds have when they spot something they like, taking his first steps with all the seriousness in the world. He spent a quarter of an hour on the sidewalk trying to teach him to say Papa, with results the boy clearly found more entertaining than conclusive. Clara watched from 2 steps back. Didn't intervene. One Thursday, Mateo ran a fever. Clara let Alejandro know with a short message from work, asking nothing. He showed up at the apartment that evening with a pharmacy bag, the right one, nothing excessive, and stayed until the boy fell asleep. He didn't ask if he could stay, didn't try to turn it into anything else. When Mateo finally closed his eyes, Alejandro put on his coat and told Clara to call him, no matter the hour. She called that same night at 11, when the fever climbed a little. He picked up on the second ring. By the time he got there, Clara already had it under control, but she opened the door anyway. One Friday, when the previous month's daycare bill threatened to become a problem, Alejandro asked Clara before doing anything. He asked if he could help. She said no, that she already had it handled. He nodded, and didn't bring it up again, not because he didn't want to help, but because he'd learned that respecting someone's no, without negotiating it, is a form of love with no elegant name, but one that weighs more than any check. Clara noticed all of it. Noticed it without saying so. That was her way of processing things. She noticed the difference between the man who fixed faucets without asking and the man who asked before he moved. It was the same man, but he was changing in the right direction. And for someone who decided not to trust easily again, that was the only thing that could ever work. Saturday night. Mateo had been asleep since 8:30, which didn't happen as often as Clara would have liked, but that night, for reasons known only to the universe, it did. Alejandro was on the living room floor, not because of any accident. He was on the floor because that's where he'd ended up, trying to assemble the wooden train he'd bought Mateo the week before, in a fit of optimism the Swedish instructions hadn't quite justified. Clara sat curled up on the armchair, feet tucked under her, scrolling through her phone, no shoes, hair down the way it was when she no longer needed to be presentable for anyone. You've closed international mergers, she said, without looking up, and you can't put together a wooden train. Mergers don't come with instructions in Swedish. I'll send you the translation app. Already have it. Doesn't help. Clara lowered her phone, looked at him, that man, on the floor of her living room, in a suit that cost a fortune, surrounded by colorful train pieces, his hair slightly mussed because Mateo had run his hand through it before falling asleep, and he hadn't bothered to fix it. With that look of concentration, he gave equally to assembling a toy and to running a shareholders' meeting. She felt something in her chest she no longer wanted to fight. Alejandro set the pieces down, stared at the half-built train, then looked at her. Clara. Yes. I don't want to ask you to forget. She brought her feet down off the armchair, looked at him. I don't want you to erase what happened. I don't want to buy you a second chance. A pause. I want to build something where you never have to ask permission to exist again. Silence. Alejandro. Marry me. The words landed in the room as simply as rain falls. No scene, no production. Just those words. He didn't get up off the floor. Immediately, he reached into the pocket of the jacket folded over the armchair and pulled out a small box. Opened it. A simple ring, a small diamond, nothing showy. The kind of ring chosen by someone who understood it was never about the price. I bought this almost 2 years ago, he said. I didn't know when to bring it out. Didn't know if it would ever be possible. A pause. I kept waiting to earn the moment. Clara looked at him. Marry me. Not to give me a son. Not to give him my last name. Not to settle anyone down. Marry me because I want to spend the rest of my life defending the peace I should have defended from the very first day. Silence. I don't want a pretty promise, Alejandro. Then I'll give you a lifetime of proof. Clara looked at him. Looked at the ring. Looked at him again. She slid off the armchair, down to the floor beside him, took his face in her hands. I'm not telling you it doesn't hurt anymore, she whispered. I'm telling you that, for the first time in a long time, I believe you. And then she said it, one single word, no speech, no extra conditions. Yes. Because sometimes, when the right answer finally arrives after everything it cost to get there, that one word is all that's needed. He put the ring on her finger, kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that takes its time, because it no longer needs to rush. Not a beginning. A promise of what comes next. From down the hallway came Mateo's voice. Mama. They both froze. Looked at each other. The train, Clara said. So it's done by the time he sees it tomorrow. The instructions are in Swedish. I have the translation app. Mama. Mateo called again, more insistent. Clara got up. At the doorway, she paused. Stay? When I get him back to sleep, you're helping me with the train. Alejandro looked at the colorful pieces scattered around him. Then he smiled. Really smiled. The kind he never used in business meetings. The train was finished past midnight, with expired Swedish instructions and 2 cold cups of tea on the table. And Alejandro didn't go home that night. He'd spent weeks unable to stop watching her without it weighing on his chest, unable to stand a meter away from her without feeling that meter as a physical injustice. That night, finally, he didn't have to do either of those things. And because in the best love stories, the final kiss almost always comes with someone small asking for water, or a hug, or attention, at 9 o'clock at night, and because that doesn't ruin it, it completes it. And that's how the most important night of Alejandro Santamaria's life ended. Not in a restaurant with 40 years of history. Not on a terrace with Madrid spread out below. On the floor of a small living room, surrounded by wooden train pieces, with an 11-month-old son with excellent timing. Epilogue. The wedding was in spring, not at the Santa Maria estate, not at the Gala Hotel. At a small property with a garden, an hour outside Madrid, with the kind of light only the Castilian countryside has in April. There weren't many guests. Clara's mother, who'd been crying since before the ceremony even started. Lucia, who wasn't crying, but kept blowing her nose suspiciously often. Old friends. A few colleagues from the company who'd earned their place there. The Santa Maria family attended in full. Elena arrived in the right coat, with the expression of a woman who had processed things and arrived where she'd arrived. It wasn't a conversion. It was a woman who, when she lost with form. She greeted Clara, kissed her cheek, didn't say much. Sometimes you don't need to. Alejandro waited at the altar, a small wooden pergola with white flowers, no marble, no red carpet, holding Mateo. Mateo wore a white shirt with a bow tie that had been perfectly knotted for exactly 20 seconds after being put on. When Clara appeared at the far end of the garden, walking toward him alone, Alejandro didn't try to hold himself together. Mateo tugged at his undone bow tie. He let him. Clara arrived, gave Mateo a kiss on the cheek, looked at Alejandro. The bow tie, she said quietly. I know. We'll leave it. We'll leave it. In his vows, Alejandro said little. He said he wasn't promising he'd always get it right. He said he was promising to try, with everything he had. And he said one last thing, quietly, looking straight at her. I promise you'll never again be alone in a room where someone tries to make you feel like less. Clara held his gaze the whole time. nodded when he finished, not because she didn't know what to say, but because some things, when you finally hear them, don't need a response, just need to be received. And that's how this story ends. Not with a perfect ending, because perfect endings are for people who never had to earn them. With a real one. A small property in April. An undone bow tie. A boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's smile. And two people who chose each other, after everything it cost to choose. What Alejandro Santamaria learned in all that time, he didn't learn in any boardroom. He learned it on the floor of a living room, surrounded by wooden train pieces, that there are things you can't buy, can't manage, can't set with a thermostat. That some people walk into your world and make it bigger simply by being who they are. And that when one of those people walks out the door you left open, you have to decide whether you're the kind of man who accepts that or the kind of man who learns. He learned late, clumsily, with the wrong gift and instructions in Swedish. But he learned. And sometimes, that's enough to start. If you made it this far, thank you, from the heart. If this story made you sigh, made you a little angry at Alejandro, or made you believe that some people really can learn, late, but for real, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. And now tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven Alejandro after everything he did?